Yeah, man, it's nice when you're starting out something early, right? And it's kind of like you don't necessarily have like the top-notch equipment or like all this fancy stuff, and it's just about the thing that you're doing.
Oh yeah, and I plan to keep that as much as I can. I don't want to. I've kind of debated having like fancy introductions and kind of looked at some computer programs like AI to create something, but I don't know. Sometimes like low production is good. It's kind of like rustic in a way. All right, hey guys, this is a bonus episode this week. I have with me a guest. His name's Yuri. In other episodes, I have my co-host Phil with me. Today I don't, but this show is about real conversations on wrestling with faith between two different generations' perspectives, normally. But since today we're both millennials, we're probably going to misrepresent that angle. But we're still going to have like a really good conversation on Yuri's story. One of the things that I wanted to start, Yuri, if you could just kind of give us a little bit of a background of who you are, as comfortable as you like to kind of talk about, and also just give us an understanding of what it was like, being, born in Russia. One of the things that I failed to kind of say in the intro, Yuri is, a dear friend of mine, and he is of Russian descent and a part of the Russian Orthodox Church. So, Yuri, you can have your intro.
Well, thank you for having me on the podcast. First and foremost, you said it's truly a humbling experience, and I hope that we can definitely touch some hearts because that's obviously one of the things that we have to do before anybody's mind can be changed. Well, hello everyone. My name is Yuri, and originally I came from Russia when I was 11 years old, just at the start of the millennium. And I currently work in the medical field, specifically psychiatry, and it's a separate story in itself how I got here. Uh, it's been a number of different kind of paths and journeys that brought me here, and I'm very glad that indeed that I ended up here. And maybe the word "ended up" is not necessarily the correct one because as we know, our journey is constantly ongoing. And so I wanted to come on a podcast and talk about my experiences, what has transpired in my life, the wrestling with the ideas of faith and the things that were initially maybe taught to me by either by certain teachers or by certain cultural changes, and kind of give a little bit of a perspective. I know that this is you and I, these are both, like I said, millennials. And so there's not much representation of the, boomer generation, baby boomer generation. But I think that there's a certain cultural element that may be important to consider here. And obviously, I just represent one culture in a very minuscule way. But I think it's an important aspect about that can give people a certain element of perception and kind of guide them in a sense what the experience of atheism was like, right? And there's the state imposed atheism and self imposed atheism. And in that regard, I think that it's a uh, very underlying current that may not necessarily be as evident, right, to people who just grew up in this culture. And so, yeah, this is kind of my introduction. And, amongst the many stories that I could say from my life, how God intervened and what kind of things transpired. I think there's a couple of interesting ones that stand out that may be relatable to a lot more people, especially of our generation, especially since that there's so much content out there, right? Everybody's competing for attention, competing for maybe even your spiritual attention, right? And so it's very difficult, I think, to find something that's not an extraordinary story or being sold to us as an extraordinary story, but more like real life, and still perpetual ongoing struggle because at the end of the day that's what our life is, right? Life, there's a big part of suffering imbued into living life as we currently experience it.
And you told me in the past that you grew up in the Russian Orthodox Church. Was that something that you experienced from your earliest memories, or give the audience like an understanding of what it was like being, in Russia with that kind of faith background, just so they have like some context and understanding.
Right. So this is a very good starting point. My grandma was very religious, right? And I was born right at the essential collapse of the Soviet Union, right? That's that's when the entire USSR fell apart, and 15 republics stayed away from the Russian economy, Russian culture, started developing their own, that kind of thing. And the country at that time was undergoing a lot of transformation, in a sense where there's, if we're just talking about one angle of the atheism, right, of the cultural and the social side, there's this state imposed atheism that's been around since, I don't know, 1921, after the revolution, after the Bolsheviks came to power. But it was one of the, kind of interestingly enough, generationally speaking, there was the older generation that essentially grew up with no concept of church, or maybe minimal concept of church. The churches in Russia were under communist rule. They were closed down for the majority of the time. Since the 50s, after Stalin died, churches started kind of reopening a little bit, but in general, there's not a lot of support from the government towards churches, unlike it is now in Russia, right? And geopolitical stuff going on now aside, in general, there's been a revival of the Russian Orthodox Church back in Russia right now. Whether that's a political move or something else, it's hard to say. But the the experience that I had as a kid was, my grandma essentially was, a lifelong Christian, uh, Russian Orthodox, and she made sure that I was baptized, and she took me to church a lot of the times. If I was like a day off, there's no day off, you go to church, right? And the church services in Russia, specifically Russian Orthodox Church, it's not an easy service exactly. There's no pews, right? We don't sit in the church at all. There's only standing room. And the services are about, we call it liturgy, especially on Sundays, but the services are about 3 to 4 hours long, right? And so this was kind of my initial exposure, was that I was taken to church. And mind you, and where I lived in the Urals, it's a very, very cold climate, right? Probably 7, 8, 9 months out of the year. Um, and so this is one of those exposures that I had in my earlier earlier life, when I was like 6 or 7, 8. I remember going to church, going to confessions, and I always thought of it as like, okay, this is something that I have to do, right? I I have to do it because grandma says it. And whenever I would go over to my grandma's house, we would hang out, we would talk about things, we would, have this kind of, I guess, for a 7 or 8 year old, this was kind of like, you know, pastime. My grandma didn't have a TV. She always said, the TV is the devil. And interestingly enough, right, like I always thought my grandma was like, she only finished 8th grade. She went to work as a crane operator, believe it or not. And but she was always very devout, religious, right? And so whenever I would stay at her house, I would always read the scriptures, right? We would say prayers before after meals, this kind of thing, blessing the food. And I kind of got into that habit. And when we moved to the United States, when I was already 11 years old, 11, 12, turns out you don't necessarily have to go to church, right? There's no quote unquote church, right? In essence, you go to school, you wake up in the morning on Saturday, on Sunday, you can watch cartoons, you can go hang out with your friends. Life's good, you know. The other aspect to this I might want to mention is that in Russia, like, you had school 6 days a week. So you would go to school on Saturdays. It's a little bit of a shorter day, but you still have classes, so it's constant learning, so it's not like a day off, right? And so here you come to the United States, and the emphasis is on liberty, on freedom. You do what you want, expression, etc., etc. And it's not that I was, as a kid, like I was a profound atheist, but it kind of became a whatever, a past experience in my life, right? Where it wasn't a daily thing. It wasn't even something that I thought about, right? Like it was just something that I was exposed to when I was a kid, and it didn't make a difference to me at that time, right? And I was like, oh, great, cartoons on Saturdays, hang out with friends, life's good. And so, there's a big element of, if we're talking about Russian Orthodoxy or Orthodoxy in general, the way that I grew up, it was essentially part of this routine in your life. It's not even that you do this regularly, but everybody understands, okay, today is Easter, right? There's Christmas, there's Theophany, there's the major church calendar events. And it's embedded in the culture, especially once the Soviet Union fell apart. There was that revival, but in essence, there's a almost like a spiritual tug of war between the generation that was before and the upcoming generation that is now allowed, quote unquote, to come back into church. And so a lot of the churches started reopening. A lot of the people were coming back, were starting to get back into the prayer life. And in 1998, the default happened, right, in Russia. And so essentially the currency of everyone became worth nothing, right? And so that during that time specifically, I believe the country went through a big transformation, and on a spiritual sense that may not have necessarily materialized until now, in some sense. But when I came here in the year 2000, it was it was such a cultural shift for me that it's not my priority as a kid at that time was not necessarily of, okay, let me go to church, right? Let me learn the language. Let me understand what lettuce versus cabbage means, right? Let me understand what, what I mean? Like there's these things that I couldn't pick up because I was learning, quote unquote, English, but it was British version of English. So it was a little bit of a different thing for me to kind of learn what is, oh, I don't wanna versus no, I don't want to, right? The words ain't weren't, there's no jargon, there's no accent, there's no things that I ever picked up on. And so in essence, when I started acclimating, right, I went to high school, I essentially, that part of my life, essentially my spiritual life, atrophied, right? It fell away, fell to the wayside. My mom, she was not necessarily a religious woman, but she was always spiritual and faithful, and she was very big into developing your heart as a person, right? She wanted to make sure that I make a choice on my own. And interestingly enough, she had faith in that regard that I would make the right one. But losing faith here, I couldn't necessarily even conceptualize that as a loss because, as a 14 or 15-year-old kid now going into high school, you're like, okay, friends is what matters, right? Developmentally, friends is what matters. Girls, right? Hobbies, interests, gym, working out, music, partying, et cetera, et cetera. And, I wouldn't even necessarily say that the shift was gradual. I would maybe conceptualize it as more just as part of something in the past in old country, right? We live in old country, that's old stuff. Now we're here, now we're American, right? Well, there's this element that you can't really make a square peg, can't fit it into a round hole in a sense, right? So the the thing that you don't really realize as a kid, uh, you don't understand what it is that you're, quote unquote, losing, right? Because you never thought that you gained it because it was part of who you are, your culture, that kind of thing, until you go through some personal difficulties. And As far as regaining faith, um, I would say the transformation is rather interesting in itself because it's not, a lot of the times people look for that one single variable that brought somebody back to their faith, right? Some kind of one humongous event. And I can't necessarily say that there was one, but there were quite a few, right? And depending on what kind of your disposition is, like your heart, what is your heart disposed to? Um, you either strengthen your faith or you weaken it, or you make choices that lead you into a direction that sometimes you may not even recognize that you're in, right? And so, when I graduated high school, I went to college. I was a very proud atheist at that point, right? That element of pride, right? I thought that this whole God thing, it's completely irrelevant to my life, and two, why should it be relevant to anybody else's, right? And so I would take debate classes. I would debate with you know Christians, right? And I would have this uh, kind of nice little arranged box of talking points from the Richard Dawkins type of atheism, right? Like, well, spaghetti monster, et cetera, et cetera. And I'd be very good at it. Like, I mean, I won a debate, quote unquote, won a debate against like three or four people in a group where well, there's no proof of God, well, et cetera, right? And it's all fun and good, right? Fun and games when you're 22 and you think that, especially as a young man with like youthful exuberance, you think that you can talk smack to a lot of people, or you know, uh, you don't have to explain yourself to anybody, or everything, right? Like that's one of the biggest aspects that I see in youth in general, is that they can't be told anything, and neither could I, right? And so at that point in my life, I think that I thought of myself as like this intellectual, right? Like science minded, science oriented. I was taking science classes, excelling, like going towards something more scientific, right? But I went through a series of difficulties in my life. My dad got diagnosed with cancer, and he ended up dying back in 2014. And at that time I was already kind of questioning a lot of my own beliefs without even necessarily realizing it, right? And the way that I found that out was that, even though I had this understanding in my mind that, I was atheist and like believing in God didn't make any sense, right? It doesn't make rational sense. It's irrelevant. It doesn't make any changes one way or another in your life. Well, God has a sense of not just of humor, but also a way of knowing how to humble you without beating you down, right? And so it's often that you hear that God is not going to give you a challenge that you cannot handle, right? Especially with His help. But with my dad getting sick, and I was under a lot of pressure at that time. I was in school and I was working every weekend. My 6-year relationship was gone, right? It evaporated for one reason or another, with the girl that I was dating at that time. And one of the things that my mom always told me at that time was, she said, you know, don't ask the question. It wasn't even about a God conversation, but don't ask the question as to why is this happening to me, because that question is very dangerous. And she wasn't talking specifically about Christ, but she was talking about the both the psychology and the heart aspect of it. She would say that, when you ask that question, like, why is this, all this bad is happening to me? The way that I understood it and that I interpreted from many conversations that we had was that when you're asking the question, why does this happen to me? Does this bad happen to me? And other people don't get to experience this. Well, you're putting yourself first, right? And your suffering as the primary thing. And that's not necessarily the right way to look at life, right? It's not insightful. It doesn't give you the full context of the picture, because she made sure that I understood that one way or another, suffering is a part of life, right? And whether or not I accept it is a very different story, right? So that was kind of like a, maybe that was a seed that was a little bit more germinated that I thought, right? And so even though that I didn't have a structural kind of understanding of what prayer was, I prayed in my own way, right? In my own difficulties during the very difficult emotional times when I, wasn't able to sleep because of grief, because of heartbreak, right? I was asking for guidance and understanding, and just to kind of try to help me get through this. Um, One of the things that I had to say was that, even though I found myself very angry and in a lot of heated debates with, Christians, right? These quote unquote religious people, I cannot say that I was ever, I ever felt the emotion of anger towards God, right? Having said that, like maybe it's maybe one of those things where, 14 or 15 years ago, you don't exactly remember what you were feeling at that time, but I never had that kind of vitriol towards God himself, but maybe more towards the idea, right? Towards the idea of Christianity, the idea of faith. Like, how can you believe something so irrational, right? And a lot of it is, interestingly enough, a lot of it is a very straw man attack, right? So, like, like, how can you would see something on Reddit, right? And you would have a whole bunch of people agree with you, and it's like a nice little echo chamber, and you feel, I don't know, either empowered or maybe supported in some regard. But point being, you have this idea, you have this notion that you're so wholeheartedly right, and how can somebody else be so dumb, right? There's a lot of hubris and a lot of pride in that, which is in itself a very toxic kind of predisposition towards life. And so there's a big aspect of humility that kind of develops within you, in response to difficult situations, if you have that grace, right? Like, if you're given the gift from God to be able to start developing that insight. um, if you let God kind of work on your heart, you're able to start understanding the level of suffering that maybe it's not just you, and two, you're not as fancy or as good as you think you are, right? And so from that point, I kept praying, kept saying prayers, even though it wasn't, maybe not every night, but I would say to myself, like, what is the purpose? Can I get that guidance, right? The personal struggles weren't, it wasn't just one struggle, right? Like, there was multiple layers to it and a lot of difficulties. And so I can't exactly pinpoint a specific pivotal moment where I regained quote unquote faith, but I knew I started having a pull. Um, but interestingly enough, speaking about a pull, my dad, when I first got into high school, my dad would drive me to school, and we would pass by a certain church, right, on the road, 5 days a week. And I would drive by it with him, and I was like, every time I would see it, I'm like, man, I should go in there. And this is like 13, 14, 15 years old. This is for like 4 years. And mind you, at this time, I'm thinking to myself, like, I'm fully atheistic. Why would I do that? Like, I'm subscribing to this ideology that I am fully committed to, right? And I will argue with people about this, like, how illogical their thought pattern is, like, how truly it makes no sense. How would you feel? Imagine how you would feel if you could be liberated from this kind of pretentious ideology, if you just understood science is this, and there's no proof of God, et cetera, right? So there's a lot of kind of um, conflicting thought processes, or maybe it's heart versus brain, right? What you want to believe, or you were convinced that you want to believe this, and what your heart truly wants, right? And so this was actually the church that I go to now, interestingly enough. But in the moment when all this stuff happens, like you don't really recognize it, right? You don't recognize that this is a slow process, and it's not a consistent upwards trajectory of like, okay, I'm getting closer and closer and closer and closer to my faith. People falter, right? People fall away. People go through different struggles, different, emotional periods. So it's never like a consistent progress. So one of the things, actually, as a side note, one of the things that I noticed in many younger converts, right, who have this initial zeal of like, okay, I'm gonna, hold all the fasts of the Orthodox Church or whatever church that they go to. I will hold all the fasts. I will go to every mass, every liturgy, every service. It's very difficult for them in a couple of years down the line to not feel a certain sense of maybe guilt. I don't know what the emotion would be described as specifically for everyone, but maybe guilt, or maybe being hard on themselves for not keeping up that zeal, right? Because it's not always easy. Things happen. People get ill. People become, emotional. There's a wide variety of things that can happen that can take somebody away from their faith. And one of the things that I would, if I could talk to anybody out there and let them know, like, that's a normal process of struggling with faith. That's a very, maybe normal is not the right word to use contextually, but it's not an unusual process. And so the aspect of regaining faith isn't singular, right? It's a constant evolution and constant desire, and constant willingness to consistently pursue faith, even when you may not feel like it, even when it's difficult to say prayers consistently, right? And it doesn't make anybody a bad person, but we struggle with that notion, especially younger men. There's this idealism, right? I have to do this. I have to. This is what's prescribed to me. And if I don't do this, I'm a bad Christian, or I'm a bad person. I'm an undisciplined man, woman, whatever. Um, but the reality is that it's not always we're gonna hear God's voice. Um, there are times when there's a specific element of silence which He allows us to sit in, to contemplate, to continue to renew our faith. Um, and so, there are certain struggles that I feel like have gotten me closer to the faith, closer to church. And I can go into a specific one that may be, a little bit more interesting to your listeners, if that's something that you'd like
Yeah, I just
to
wanted to
provide
kind of
with.
quickly summarize some ideas here because, again, thank you for being on and just kind of sharing that amazing testimony. And I think one of the biggest takeaways that I kind of, you know, take from your story is this idea of, sometimes people don't have this dramatic, come to Jesus moment, so to speak, where they see these giant changes in their life, but there's that constant working that is happening in the backdrop. Sometimes things even seem like unnoticeable at times because there wasn't like a specific time that you can recall that was your catalyst or your pivot point. But one of the things that I would love to really kind of understand, using what that story that you were going to talk about, but also you know when did you know that you had um, some foundation underneath you? Like for the people that are listening that maybe don't have faith, uh, how do they know or come to understand that they have something tangible in their life or that they're on the right path? Because especially if things aren't as pronounced, they might not know that they're on the right track.
Mm. It's a very powerful question. Certainly a lot of layers to it. You know, I think it's very unique for, and it's very individual for every person to kind of recognize the path that they're currently on, and having the willingness to not necessarily even change it per se, but a desire to seek more, right? And so sometimes the suffering is the thing that makes us want to seek more, right? Because there has to be more than this, more than this thing that I'm experiencing now that feels like it's going to go on forever. Um, Coming back to the actual church, right? To the Orthodox Church, it's very difficult for me to pinpoint a specific point in my life where I was in terms of like emotions, spirituality, that kind of thing. But I remember now, my now wife, we were newly married, and I remember her and I would just talk back and forth because we're from the same culture, same faith. And I was like, we should go to church sometime or another. Maybe you and I, yeah, let's go. It's kind of like a thing like in the back of your mind, right? Like it would be nice type of thing. And my godson, actually, my first godson now, uh, friend of mine, very good, very dear friend of mine, not overly religious at all. Uh, but I introduced him and his current wife through one way or another, right? But they're married, and they have three beautiful kids, and their firstborn is my godson. And he asked me, he's like, "Hey, well, can you be godfather?" And I'm like, "Well, of course. Like that's not even a question. Of course. Yeah, just tell me when and where." And so he did. We went to church. We set everything up, and it was actually in that church that I kept driving by when my dad going to high school, and I'm like, "Oh, it's gonna be nice. I wonder what it's like." And so I remember it clear as day now. As a matter of fact, like I look back at it, I come into the church, and before you come in, you always make the sign of the cross, right? In respect, and Father, Son, Holy Spirit, you have that kind of reverence, right? And the first thing that I see there is the priest that currently serves, Father Victor. It's almost as if he like glided out, right? Very well poised, soft spoken, um, incredible guy. But the first probably 10 seconds that I talked to him, I felt an immediate presence, not just with him, but in the whole church. And the only thing that I kind of could discern from that in my human logical quote unquote mind is that I have to be here. And I don't know why. I have no idea. I have no idea what it is that, and it's kind of like one of those things where we're like, okay, it's a thought that ran through my mind. How logical is it? How empirical? Like, what is this going to look like, right? Because I have no idea how this is going to even play out. And so, we baptized my godson, and everything's great. But from that day on, I'm like, I have to be there, right? And I don't know why, I don't know how, and I'm working practically every weekend at that time. And I said to my wife, I'm like, let's go. And she's like, okay, no resistance, right? And sometimes there's this situation, I suppose, in couples where one is more devout than the other, or one wants it more than the other, or there's different spiritual understandings, experiences, upbringings, right? I was blessed to not experience that. We went there, right? And at that point in time, we were actually not married yet. We were just engaged. And this, interestingly enough, this was in March, right? And in June, we were planning to get married, which we did. And I don't know, we started going periodically on every weekend that we had free. We started going, and the challenge that we experienced was that even though we grew up in the church, right, we read the Bible in Russian, like the kid Bible, right? Because at that point, like we were kids, and we heard the word. The challenge there is that you're considered cradle Orthodox if you grew up, if you were baptized as a baby, and so a lot of the things, especially in American Orthodoxy, because the church is OCA. Orthodox Church of America. It's a little bit different. It's more, obviously, it's in English, but our priest is Ukrainian. And so a lot of the things we didn't even understand, right? We knew the service structure, right? We knew the Eucharist, we knew the confession, but that's just kind of like the general basis. You don't necessarily know the specifics, right? And so the experience at church was essentially kind of like being back there the first time. Uh, and if I had to pinpoint like a spiritual renewal, that would be it for me. That would be the first kind of episode of spiritual renewal. But it's not like jumping into a big lake of sorts. It's the feeling is there, right? The emotion is there, but the knowledge necessarily isn't. And so there's this kind of discontent, right? Where you're like, okay, I feel there's something here, but I don't understand it. And it seems like many people experience that in one way or another on their own unique path, on their own unique journey. But not everybody necessarily follows, right? And it's because sometimes people feel either they don't understand or this is too much. And that's, at least to me, right? All this that I'm talking about is you know n equals one. It's just my experience. That feeling of I have to be here, right? I don't know why, but I do. That is kind of like the encapsulation of the idea of faith for me, where I may not know rationally or logically or, you know, even the services, right? I don't remember them because they're in a new language for me. The way that I heard them were in Russian, a little bit different structure, right? A little bit longer. And so it's very different kind of going into faith, especially if you have like a rationalistic mindset, right? Where you're like, okay, so I'm a rational, empirical person. I need facts, I need figures, I need to know exactly what it is that I'm following, right? And so just going into the church and feeling and almost hearing it that I have to be here and not knowing why, that's kind of like the first testament of faith to yourself, to as a spiritually growing person, right? And so I think a lot of people who experience this type of thing and they walk away from it, um, at times they let fear or uncertainty or discomfort or feeling like they're looking silly kind of dominate that and take away from their faith, from the path that can be very rewarding and enriching and life changing, right? Because one of the things that I wanted to make sure that I emphasize is that, when I came to the United States, I didn't necessarily understand as a kid what it is that I was losing, right? Because one, not just because I couldn't conceptualize it, but two, because I didn't realize the treasures that I had, right? The love of Christ, the guidance that I could have from Him in my life, whether it's spiritual or emotional or through difficult struggles, which doesn't, just looking at the world today, it doesn't seem like it's gonna be much easier anytime soon, right? And so it makes you feel real pity for the people who are now, right, in the position of arguing, for example, with me about why religion or faith or Christianity is illogical, right? You see you see the faults in their arguments, but you cannot change their mind. You can only be a person of good character, of good faith, um, and try to change their heart and just to show them that, hey, maybe there is something else beyond what you believe to be the real thing right now and the only thing that matters, right? Because a lot of times in atheism that's the only thing that matters. That's your identity. That's how everything else is. And you can say that's hostile for atheism, but there's also the aspect of And I think that is a scarier one, the lukewarmness, right? Being lukewarm, being like, okay, I'm sure there's a God, I'm sure there's a creator, could even be Christ, right? But, to me, it doesn't make a difference. To me, it doesn't play any role in my life. And, you can be a good person without Christ, right? And while, maybe we don't know how Christ works on anybody's heart, right? And one of the things that my mom always taught me was that, don't judge people based on what they say that they believe, right? Try to look at their actions and their hearts and how they are. Um, you know, it's it's very difficult to try to convince them otherwise, right? With just words. And you feel a lot of empathy for them. And that's what we should be feeling as Christians, right? Even though it can be hard. And not everybody, if you really think about it, not everybody is blessed with an experience of sort of humbling suffering, right? The suffering, the difficulties in life that make you want to be closer to Christ. And so it's if somebody is out there and is questioning their ideas, right? They're logical, hyper rational, like especially a lot of the young men. I can't speak for young women, but or their experience, but in the context of seemingly more nihilistic world, or maybe more, I wouldn't even say necessarily more hyper rational, but maybe a world that's more now become much more atheistic in a sense where it's become one big me, right? All about the self development, self improvement. Even these words, these perceptions, this cognition kind of permeates our daily life. Like, who am I? What's my identity? Um, for those people, I would say try to look outside of yourself, not just your mind, right, but your heart and your spirit. And me saying prayers despite the fact that I was, a seemingly atheist, right? It was an interesting kind of, again, tug of war almost between my mind and my heart. But fact of the matter is, like, if you're saying prayers, even if you don't necessarily know how, right? Even if you're seeking, even if you want to, you don't necessarily have to get everything. You will never get everything perfect, right? That's never a thing, right? Only Christ is perfect. But if you want, if you're wanting, if you're seeking and you want Christ's help and simply asking for it, right? Matthew 7:7, ask and you shall receive. Asking for that help will you will get it. You may not necessarily get it the way that you think you want, right? And it may not necessarily take just a couple of days like speed mail, right? But in general, it's one of those things that there's an element of our effort that we have to put in order to understand ourselves and Christ and our faith more.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue. I actually wanted to lead into a scripture that I had prepared for this episode. And again, like one of the things that I really love about the opportunity to have this kind of a podcast is to learn from different, denominations and thought process. Because, in my opinion, in most cases, a lot of these different, angles and sects, both believe in that Jesus is, who he said he was, the Son of God, all these different things that kind of unify us under a certain idea. And so much of the world that I see now is so divided by whose tribe is right, right? It is, this denomination right? Is this person right? What about this person on Instagram or TikTok? Are they right? And I guess like I don't want to come across as a person who has the answers, more as someone who has the questions. Because I feel like questions uh, beget more questions, right? And they allow us to kind of understand ideas a little bit better. But what I want to do is I want to go into a, a few verses in the book of Acts. Acts is in the New Testament, and it covers a lot of different stories. So it's one of my favorite books. But in Acts 17, there's this excerpt about Paul the apostle. We've talked about him before, um, and he's standing in front of what is kind of like portrayed as a lot of Greek philosophers and different like religious leaders of that time, right? And there's a word in this verse called Areopagus. And one of the things I like about the Bible is when I read something and I don't know what it means, I kind of look it up, right? That's like a really good way of getting a better understanding of the context because again, the Bible is written in a time period much different than our own, so we have to kind of pick apart some of these ideas a little bit. But the Areopagus was in Greece in that ancient time, their version of Capitol Hill, right? So we think of the White House. Imagine this apostle or this prophet standing in front of the White House, like kind of talking to these different guys, right? In Acts 17:22, it says, So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription. And the inscription writes, To the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you, that the God who made the world and everything in it, being the Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. I'm going to stop there because that can be a really giant, um, excerpt
Mhm.
from someone who doesn't know the Bible. And there's a lot of different applications that you can kind of take this as. But one of the things that I kind of lead with this podcast is this notion that we all kind of have different temples in our life. Maybe it's a different form of church or a different denomination. There's like these different kind of places that we kind of align under culturally, right? Being Russian Orthodox or Catholic or Pentecostal or whatever, different flags, if you will. But one of the things that Paul says that I find so profound is the fact that God can't be contained in walls, right? And it doesn't mean that we abandon the walls, and it doesn't mean that the walls are incorrect, and it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be there. And I try and choose my words carefully, but I think the biggest underlying thing that I try and communicate with the people that I talk to is this notion of uh, if God isn't contained in anything physical, uh, how is he contained in your life outside of the things that are physical, right? For you, Yuri, like a lot of your, upbringing and your transformations are directly connected, to the Orthodox Church. And you said something interesting earlier in the podcast where, you had kind of alluded to, being at that one church being so transformative, and which I think it can be for many people. But sometimes people don't have that luxury, whether they live in a certain area or
Mhm.
whatever their insert their troubles. Maybe they had a bad experience. I think one of the biggest things that I want to come across as having people understand that um, if God doesn't necessarily only exist in a physical place, you can access Him indefinitely, right? And that should be an encouragement. Like someone at home, like you said, even if you say the prayers incorrectly, He still hears you, and there's still like a work that's being done in your life, whether it's very slow or gradual. And I don't always hear that being said sometimes because I think some people take the stance that church is a negative thing, or you can only go to church, or you got to go to this church, or you're not in the right place, and they get very legalistic about it. but I live in a world where things can exist. They can cohabitate, right? So what I want
Hmm.
to really kind of talk about is more so this notion of, if God truly, isn't confined in this box, how do you feel maybe currently, with where you are currently in your wrestling with faith? How can you see that grow outside of that construct? Or is that something that you haven't even really, put a lot of thought into, So maybe we can have that conversation quickly.
Yeah, that's a very good segue into it. It- First and foremost, like there's something that I wanted to point out to my earlier stories, that when I said that I started praying, right, I wasn't praying in church, right, and I didn't know how to, even though that I I have the conceptualization of what God is, that it's Christ, um, and I have the kind of the habits when I was a kid, kind of like I understand the structure, right, and even now I understand the importance of structure. Um, at that time where I was, I didn't know which way was up, right? Emotionally, spiritually, I was constantly feeling down, and I didn't know what kept me going at that time, during the times of struggle and difficulties. But I said prayers, what I felt were right on my heart, right? And the point here for me isn't to say that don't go to church, right? Because I do believe that there is a strong element of necessary structure that church gives you, right? And the Orthodox believe uh, that Christ and church, it's you find that God comes down during liturgy from heaven to church, right? And there's a big discussion that can be had about that, but not a matter of debate is prayer and willingness, right? The idea that you want something, um, something to change, but realizing that you have to maybe change something in your heart or in your mind first, or in
Mm.
your life. And so there's that aspect of, I wasn't necessarily in a structural sense, right? Like I was in my room at 4 in the morning, couldn't sleep, mind going, very difficult stuff, and certain decisions that I was wrestling with. It was a very difficult kind of, again, you don't know which way is up, you don't know which direction is even the direction, right? And so the only thing that you have at that point in time is prayer, right? And so even if you don't have any direction at that time, and you feel like you're in complete absolute darkness, right, there's a humongous element of hope and faith, right? And even if it's a small flickering light somewhere, that can at least get you to follow it, right? And there's this point that I maybe semi deliberately left in our earlier conversation about what being a quote unquote good person is, right? And a lot of the times people ask, well, I'm a good person. They ask themselves, why is this happening to me? Again, that dangerous question, right? And there's an element of danger in that perception. And when I say danger, I mean spiritually speaking, right? Being spiritually misled. Um, there's an element there that people may not realize, because while maybe they are a good person, right? Or maybe they feel like they're a good person, or maybe they don't feel like they're a good person, but they are, right? They may be feeling like they're good and they want to be good, but they're operating in a very dark and evil space, right? And so there's that aspect of being directionless spiritually, right? And so no matter what the denomination of a person is, right, whether it's you know non-denominational, Orthodox, whatever, uh, Catholic, Pentecostal, whatever, in the very least, when you're lost, right, and when you're struggling, in the very least, saying a prayer, um, of any kind that you can muster up within your heart to be able to say, that gives you somewhere to take a step towards. That in itself is a very big, it's a humongous step, right? Even if it's just one. You know, they say the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Nobody but you can make that step for you. And there's a huge component of peace, knowing that if you make the first steps and then you make another step and another step and another step towards Christ, he will not abandon you. He will never walk away from you. People underestimate the importance of prayer and underestimate the importance of faith and hope that plays out in their life. And you or somebody may lie to themselves, right, saying that, empirically, if I just follow logical steps and do this and do that, well, then my life will be good. Well, let's say that is the case, but somebody finds no meaning in that. Then are they really happy? Is their heart filled with joy? Are they at peace with their own self, with their own experience, right? And if I had to say where I am currently in my faith, like I still have struggles, right? It's certainly not been an easy time ever since COVID, and amongst some of the other experiences in my life, the thing that I truly believe, right? When we think, why am I suffering? Why am I struggling? Right? You always have to remember that Christ suffered and he struggled and he died for our sins, right? And so it's very easy again for us to just sit in our mind and sit in whatever it is that we're feeling in that darkness, right? And say, why is it happening to me? Why am I suffering so much? Why do I have to suffer so much? If I could just eliminate X thing or whatever, sometimes people don't even know that, right? Then everything would be great. Well, maybe, but really, it's hard to say. And it's a tough sell for a lot of people because we live in a society, we live in a world that kind of panders to our idea, to our mindset of, hey, if you just do this, you're now in the before. And if you just do this, insert 12-step program or 12-week self-development course or whatever Tony Robbins-esque type of stuff, then you will be in the after picture, that you will be happy, wealthy, healthy. Your back is never going to hurt. You're going to make consistent progress in the gym. Your diet will be perfect. You will have a beautiful spouse and life will be great. And thereafter, right? Reality isn't, reality is far from that, right? Because even though you may have good periods in your life, or bad ones, right, or difficult ones, struggles, joys, it's all, how you said, it's all intermixed, right? And I my job, I work in a very gray area field, um, of a lot of kind of mental, cognitive, sometimes spiritual work, right? Where it's never black or white. It's never a binary kind of definitional thing. Because, while we may think that something has a very rationalistic approach, you're a very rational person, analytical, or whatever, planning out certain steps, while it's good to plan, right? How much control do you really have of your life over certain events? Nobody had control over the COVID events that happened. Um, Nobody had any idea what those 2 weeks, just for 2 weeks really meant, right? Nobody understood the levels of impact on the economy, on people's spiritual sides, on their emotional and mental well-being. But there's always a silver lining, and there's always prayer and there's always hope. That is the element where, at least from my personal experience and from my perspective, that's where, maybe unstructured prayer comes in, right? While structure is good, from my perspective, obviously, structure is good. There's always that element that you have to develop first in your heart, that you have to be willing to step towards Christ. You have to be willing to change maybe some of the ways that are not benefiting you, either spiritually, physically, or all the ones that are around you. And I know I've mentioned this before to you in our sessions, but uh, one of my most favorite sayings is that, achieve peace in your heart and thousands around you will be saved. Because during those times of fear and difficulty where everybody's going through things, right? Like during COVID, um, the people who are strong-minded and strong-spirited, right? They really brought a lot of peace to others. And that in itself is a very, very big contribution, because you never know what kind of impact you're going to have on somebody, on somebody's life, on somebody's well-being, right? Even extending certain kind words or a kind gesture in the time of somebody's need, you can alter the trajectory of their life, um, so much that you don't even realize, right? And it's easy to say you or the person, right? Oh, I did that, right? But is it really ever us, or is it God working through us? Um, I'm inclined to say now, as a as a reformed atheist, that it's the latter, with pretty strong conviction, I'd say.
And I love that. I mean, we can go on for forever talking about different aspects of it, but I think most
Yeah.
importantly, um, I just want to create a forum where people have the ability to share about, their faith, and also where they come from, either generationally or denominationally. And I think this kind of warrants like another episode at a future place, so we can kind of have, maybe not necessarily more difficult conversations, but kind of dissect some of the things that we went over at a later time. But I
Mhm.
think I'm going to use this as the kind of the curtain call to kind of wrap it up. Just because I want to be respectful of your time, but also not have super, super long podcasts where people feel that they can't listen to. Um,
Mhm.
so I do appreciate your time, Yuri. If you want to kind of stay online a little bit later, but once we kind of end this, just for the audience, again, this is a bonus podcast. I am going to do another one over the weekend with Phil as he kind of comes back with our next kind of not lesson, but our next part in the series of willingness, believe it or not. So we're going to definitely continue talking about things that have been discussed over the last two podcasts. If there are any questions, you can feel free to email at us at generationfpodcast@gmail.com, or any suggestions in the future. We'll be willing to take that as well. We hope you enjoyed the rest of your weekend, and we'll see you guys later.